Good afternoon, everyone. Along with my co-director of the Center for Politics and the People, Professor Henrik Schatzinger, I'd like to welcome you, the live audience who are here, and the audience on Ripon Live YouTube, which will be watching this later, to the discussion of an important forthcoming book that helps enlighten us on the evolution of the Republican Party over the last half century. And the title, Republican Populist, Spiro Agnew and the Origins of Donald Trump's America, about to be published by the University of Virginia Press. The book is an examination of former Vice President Spiro T. Agnew's role as one of the founding fathers of the modern Republican Party, and the link between Agnew's what he called People's Party and the party of populists and business people today. Typically a maligned figure in American political history, Agnew is often overlooked. Although he is largely remembered for his alliterative speeches, his attacks on the media and East Coast intellectuals, and his resignation from office in 1973 in the wake of the tax evasion charges, Agnew had a significant impact on the modern Republican Party that sometimes is underappreciated. It is impossible, in fact, to understand the current internal struggles of the Republican Party without understanding this populist so-called every person and prototypical middle-class striver who was one of the first proponents of what would become the ideology of Donald Trump's GOP. The three co-authors of this new study are with us this afternoon, and we would like to thank them for being here and making this the first public appearance they're doing of the new book. So we're delighted that they picked Ripon first. Professor Charles Holden on your far left is Professor of History at St. Mary's College of Maryland, and is the author of the new Southern University Academic Freedom and Liberalism at the University of North Carolina. Sitting to his left and in the middle, or sitting to the far left, on my right, is Zach Messitte, whom you all know, president of Ripon College. He is also co-editor of Understanding the Global Community. And in the middle, Professor Jerald Podair, professor of history and Robert S. Frank Professor of American Studies at Lawrence University, is the author of City of Dreams, Dodger Stadium and the Birth of Modern Los Angeles. Very apropos for the baseball playoff season. President Messitte will begin the discussion, followed by remarks by Professors Holden and Podair, and after 30 to 40 minutes of discussion among the authors, President Messitte will open it up for questions with the audience. President Messitte.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Brian, and thank you, Henrik, for organizing this, and of course all the great events that the center does. I love that there are community people here as well as students and discussing topical issues. And it's great to be here with Chuck and Jerry, who I've known a long time, and we had many fabulous conversations and discussions along the way to the creation of this book, and that's been a real joy working with them, putting this together. So I've been thinking about Spiro Agnew for years, in part because I'm a Marylander, and I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., and always heard his name as this figure who played really was the only figure in the state of Maryland who ever became a nationally elected politician. So he was vice president from 1968 to 1973. The way, though, that this book started, and it's important to hear this because it shows you why we thought this was a topical issue. Chuck and I, in 2005, when I used to be a professor at St. Mary's College of Maryland, I hosted the Ben Bradley Lecture in Journalism. So many of you in the room know who Ben Bradley is. Ben Bradley was the legendary editor of the Washington Post. And Ben had a house literally across the river from St. Mary's, and he endowed a lectureship. And it was my job as a junior professor, and it was a great honor, to run the Bradley Lectureship. So I used to call Ben's office in the fall and say, who do you want to invite this year? Who should we have? And try and think of a journalist. And the year that in 2005, Ben wanted to have Richard Cohen, who's a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, come and give the talk. And Richard Cohen had been the Annapolis correspondent, the State House correspondent for the Washington Post when Agnew resigned. So he was one of the journalists who uncovered this story. So Chuck and I spent an evening at Ben Bradley's house, a couple hours with Ben and with Richard Cohen, talking about the resignation and the journalistic investigation into Agnew's resignation in 1973. And of course, Agnew's resignation was overshadowed by Watergate. And any of you have seen All the President's Men or read about the role of the Washington Post in uncovering the Watergate scandal, Woodward and Bernstein. This story is very secondary to that. And of course, Ben Bradley, who was really, Chuck and I were just talking about this yesterday, was a large figure. It was just a tremendous figure. In fact, 2 stories quickly about this, and then I'll get to it. During that, for those of you who've seen the movie All the President's Men, at one point Richard Cohen said, I can't remember whether you said this or whether Jason Robart said this in the movie, but it doesn't matter because it's the same thing at this point. The other thing Ben talked about was during the Agnew investigation, there was legal question about what the Post could publish. And this, of course, was where Ben Bradley turned to Richard Cohen and said, yeah, this was really about subpoena envy, which I thought was a good line in terms of talking about what was going on at the time. So anyway, that was the germination of this story. We were talking to Ben Bradley and Richard Cohen about Agnew, and Chuck and I both thought, hey, there is a much bigger story here than simply the story that most everyone has heard in history books or remembrance. That Agnew was really just a answer to a trivia question. And we thought, no, in fact, there's more to him in what he signified than just his alliterative speeches and the answer to who was Richard Nixon's vice president. We believe, and there's been some justification of this in the last few years, both in terms of how the Republican Party has moved in terms of its trajectory, but also in terms of media coverage. We believe he plays a far more significant role, not in policy, but in politics, and particularly the trajectory of the Republican Party over the last 50 years. And so what you're going to hear today is not a bio of Spiro Agnew, but more where he places and his importance to this development of the Republican Party over the last half century. But it's important for you all to remember this was someone who in 1960 was on the zoning board in Baltimore County, who decided to run for county judge, 1960, run for county judge, and lost. 8 years later, he was the vice president of the United States. So that trajectory was basically unmatched until Sarah Palin became a nominee and then Trump became the president in terms of a trajectory of having virtually no elective experience before taking on these incredibly big national roles. So I'm going to quickly put in context sort of how we thought about Agnew and then turn it over to my colleagues for their discussion about aspects of Agnew's importance. Oh, so here we go. Hold on. Jared, fill for me for 5 seconds.
You want me to do material?
Yeah.
Actually, I should probably mention how I ended up in this project. I am not a Marylander. I am a New Yorker, as you can tell, because I pronounce my R's like W's. And when Zach got to Ripon, I teach at Lawrence right up the road, we connected and found that we had a mutual interest in American political history generally, and certainly in Spiro Agnew as well. So I joined now a trio along with Chuck, who was already in on the project, and we thought that it was a very relevant topic, but it became a lot more relevant about 3 in the morning on November 9th, 2016, when I actually emailed both Chuck and Zach. I think our book got a lot more relevant, and I think you'll see how much more relevant it became and how relevant it is when we start talking.
So we classified, these are Republican candidates for national office since 1952. We put them into 3 categories. So broadly speaking, Republican policy from 1952 forward has been about lower taxes, strong military, particularly anti-communist during the Cold War, small government, and willing to find, in these cases, compromise with the other side, Democrats, when needed. So you see here the candidates who have green next to them are ones who were victorious, and red were ones who were not. So this is a group of people we categorize as establishment Republicans. The second group are people that were able to straddle the two sides. So people that were able to marry establishment issues with more populist domestic and international issues. So people who were, during the Cold War, were strong on anti-communist rhetoric, strong on the war on terror, but also were able to sort of bring together issues like guns and abortion, gay marriage, flag burning, under the same tent. So again, these we considered were people who straddled both the populist side and the more establishment side. And then the third group are really the populists, the ones who really spoke to this question of not ideologically pure, but more the idea that they were out there rallying the red meat issues. Who were they against? Against the media, against the intellectuals, against the establishment. And so we put these four people into that group, and you can see it's a line that starts with Barry Goldwater, who probably we would categorize as someone who moved eventually into the establishment, but not when he ran for president in 1964, right? Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. But moved into that category, and so we draw a bright line between Goldwater, Agnew, Palin to Trump. And you'll hear a little bit more later, the missing link in here is probably Pat Buchanan, who all of you will know, who coincidentally was Spiro Agnew's speechwriter. So we'll talk about him a little bit as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry for the next part here.
Oh, and here are our populists. Okay, you can't understand Spiro Agnew and the ways in which he transformed the Republican Party in the 1960s unless we understand the changes in the party that had already taken place since the 1930s, which made it possible for Spiro Agnew to become Spiro Agnew in the first place. Now, history requires a man or a woman meeting a moment. And for Spiro Agnew to meet his moment, he not only had to be in the right place, and as we'll see, he was, but the moment, his moment, had to exist. And for it to exist, the Republican Party had to change, and change elementally in the 3 decades between the advent and the triumph of the New Deal in the 1930s and the chaotic, divisive, disorienting, and often violent late 1960s. And it did. So that when Spiro Agnew was ready to champion the average American, the middle American, what would soon be called the silent majority American, a 1960s version of what Franklin Roosevelt had famously called in the 1930s the forgotten man, the Republican Party was also ready to embrace that forgotten American as well and embrace Agnew with it. And by 1968, almost unbelievably for Democrats who had been supporting labor rights and government economic policies aimed at that forgotten man for years and years, usually over the opposition of Republicans, the GOP had reinvented itself as the party of populism. Not economic populism, the way the term was traditionally understood, but cultural populism. The party of millions of white former Democrats, from the ethnic enclaves of cities, from the growing suburbs, from blue-collar union households, from the South, who by 1968 had come to fear and be concerned about cultural issues, social issues, racial issues, even more than economic ones. Crime, civil disturbances, anti-war demonstrations, student unrest, the rise of a so-called counterculture whose manifestations were incomprehensible to them, an assault on authority, be it government, religious, educational, or familial. seemingly mindless and mindlessly destructive. And notice, all of these things having very little to do, at least on the surface, with economics. So now, in 1968, the GOP could speak to these middle Americans who had voted for Roosevelt, and Truman, and Adlai Stevenson, and John Kennedy, and even as recently as 1964, Lyndon Johnson, and speak to them not in the language of economic populism, as Democrats historically did, but in the language of cultural populism, through the voice of a man whose life story, working class roots, ethnic ties, middle class persona, suburban geography, and even Democratic Party origins was their story, and to whom they could relate in a visceral and personal sense. Spiro Agnew, Republican populist, man meeting moment in 1968, the culmination of a 30-year period of what our book calls role reversal, in which the Republican Party went from the party of economic royalism to that of cultural populism. And correspondingly, the Democratic Party moved from the party of economic populism, where, for example, Franklin Roosevelt, as one of his working class supporters pronounced in 1936, is the only man we ever had in the White House who would understand that my boss is a son of a bitch. His boss, it may be presumed, was a Republican. To the party, Democratic Party, of cultural elitism, the party of the coastal elites, of the universities, of the liberal media, of the intellectuals, of the knowledge class, of the pampered young. And the GOP would be launched on a populist-driven road to Donald Trump and his America of 2016 and 2019. So, from economic elitism to cultural populism, and from economic populism to cultural elitism, at least the image or perception of these shifts, because history, of course, is not about reality, it is about perceived reality. And this shift was wrought through, of course, many public figures over the decades, Republicans and Democrats, but notably, as we argue in our book, that most unlikely leader of a counter-revolution, a man so relentlessly average that when asked about him years later, hardly anyone in his high school class even remembered him. A man so obscure that, as Zach just mentioned, he began the 1960s as a candidate for a low-level county judgeship in Maryland and lost. And whose announcement as the vice presidential candidate in 1968 was greeted with shouts of Spiro who? Without irony, these are newsmen who are actually asking that the announcement be repeated. Spiro who? Spiro who? Spiro Agnew, the man who made economic royalists into Republican populists. Now, the success of the GOP in transforming its image from royalist to populist between 1932 and 1968 was an exercise in self-invention. In one of my favorite television shows, and perhaps some of yours as well, Mad Men, advertising executive Donald Draper tells a client worried about his company's message, if you don't like what is being said, change the conversation. And this the Republican Party was able to do successfully, changing the American conversation, shifting it gradually over the course of the 40s, 50s, and 60s away from the economic issues on which they were most vulnerable. Now, of course, economic issues would never completely disappear, obviously, during the 30-year period of role reversal as the Democrats pounded away, often successfully, on pocketbook issues, what we might call the "my boss is a son of a bitch" issue. But as is so often the case in American political history, during periods of relative economic prosperity, like the period from the start of World War II to the late 60s, the nation has the relative luxury of considering cultural issues. And, of course, in the post-World War II years, the necessity of confronting racial issues, sublimating economic issues to the often emotional and personal expressions of cultural and racial angst. And this was what the GOP succeeded in taking advantage of through anti-communism, negative responses to the civil rights movement, and reactions to the cultural and racial upheavals of the late 1960s, as well as their characterization of Democrats as out-of-touch cultural elitists, as they succeeded in changing the conversation in American politics. And I think that the 1950s, in particular, were a crucial time for this. During that decade, the nation's three most prominent Republicans, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, and for better or for worse, Joe McCarthy, could all claim working-class roots and average man political sensibilities, nascent populist identities, which certainly contradicted the party of the rich image of the GOP that Roosevelt, Truman, and other Democrats had cultivated. And when combined with a marked shift among professionals, the highly educated, and members of the media toward the Democratic Party, Republicans were presented with a golden opportunity, one that would have shocked Franklin Roosevelt had he been alive to see it, and did shock Harry Truman, who was, to paint themselves with the brush of averageness, proud averageness, and populism in the ethnic wars, in the factories, in the suburbs, and in the South, while simultaneously tarring the Democrats as the party of the elites, the snobs, and, perhaps most devastatingly, the hypocrites, who use their elite privileges to insulate themselves from making any personal sacrifices for the costs of the changes they claim to favor to make America a more fair and just nation. And thus, we see in the presidential election of 1968, a Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, an economic populist if there ever was one, with pro-labor credentials going back decades, losing to the Republican Party, the party of right-to-work laws, the party of the National Association of Manufacturers, the party of the Taft-Hartley Act, with millions of working men's votes cast for Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, electing only the second Republican president in the preceding 36 years, in a nation in which culture and race had come to matter even more than pocketbook and wallet, and in which the GOP had engineered one of the most startling role reversals in American political history, for which Spiro Agnew, average man, ordinary man, had become the indispensable man, a man with many enemies, but to those Americans who viewed Agnew's story as their own, the right kind of enemies, enemies to whom Agnew would carry their fight as Vice President of the United States as he became Nixon's Nixon, his blunt instrument, and as he became the face and the voice of a new form of American populism, Republican populism, what would eventually become the populism of Donald Trump. Now I'll turn it over to Chuck, who will talk about how that came to be as Vice President.
I'm not used to a handheld, so I will try to contain my inner Bono, It feels kind of good, really. Okay, I'm going to cover 2 points that our book makes. The first is that Agnew's combative political style predated his turn as vice president. And then secondly, we'll talk about Agnew's overlooked success in recruiting white Southerners to switch to the Republican Party in the late 60s and early 70s. So, very quick bio background here. Agnew was born in Baltimore City in November 1918, son of a Greek immigrant father. He became, though, by the 1950s and 60s, really the personification of the middle class of the mid-century. He's a World War II veteran, fought at the Battle of the Bulge. He recalled sleeping on ice for a week. He finished his law degree by going to night school at the University of Baltimore, a school that wasn't accredited until the 1970s. In other words, even though he's a law student, very, very humble background there. He moved out to the suburbs of Baltimore County after World War II. He belonged to the PTA. He was the father of 4 children, the husband of with his stay-at-home wife, Judy. His passions included the Baltimore Colts and playing ping pong, right? So just normal guy. One of his many admirers likened himself to Agnew as one of the, and I'm quoting here, conservative, hardworking, middle-class, reasonably normal people. Or, as Richard Nixon would call them, the silent majority. And what we see in Agnew as a walking, talking personification of the silent majority is that while on the outside the experience looked very comfortable, right? With a television in the living room, air conditioning, and 2 cars in the garage, that for many of these middle-class drivers, life actually felt precarious and unstable. The sociologist William White wrote at the time, in this dawning middle-class world of consumerism, that somewhere, and I'm quoting, somewhere lies the good life, but it vanishes as quickly as one finds it. So from that, then, our book argues that while Agnew's verbal aggressiveness eventually made him famous as vice president, it was not simply a new act or a role he played only late in his career. We found plenty of evidence of Agnew's populism and his combative style long before he took his place on the national stage. He offered certainty and clarity and even much appreciated sternness to this nervous middle class of the 1960s. I'll give you just one example of many from these earlier years. As Zach mentioned, in the late 50s, Agnew sat on the Baltimore County Board of Appeals, which is basically a zoning board for zoning disputes. In 1961, the Baltimore County Council, all Democrats, declined to reappoint him to this board. While Agnew blamed naked partisanship for his removal, which was probably the case, he also, and significantly for our book, portrayed himself as the victim of darker forces, the aggrieved warrior for justice against the corrupt local elite. He hinted at conspiracy and charged that an underground campaign had been waged against him. In fact, it didn't seem really to be underground at all. Right? The county council was just pretty much saying, we don't want you, right? But nonetheless, the local Democratic power structure, he boasted, was, and I'm quoting Agnew, afraid they can't control me. But he said, I am not going to lie down and take it. In the final meeting where his removal was made official, the crowd almost came to blows. Here is a great example of how Agnew, despite an always calm exterior, showed an ability to stir passions, to get under people's skin, and to excite those who loved that he lashed out against those in power. So early on then, he made a name for himself as a straight-shooting politician. He developed the art of attacking opponents verbally, but then claiming he was just calmly, rationally telling it like it is, and someone had to do it. And his middle-class Baltimore County supporters loved it. Then, in the tragic days of early 1968, with the widespread urban unrest after Martin Luther King's assassination, this then serves as the backdrop for the launch of Agnew's career at the highest level. On April 11, 1968, Agnew, now governor of Maryland, called for a meeting with Baltimore's African-American leaders as the violence spilled into its third day. Around 100 African-American leaders gathered for what they thought would be a dialogue with the governor. Instead, Agnew blamed them, attacking his audience for having failed to push back against the radicalism of groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Now consider the optics here. Agnew is seated in the front of this room with an exclusively African-American audience. He is surrounded by the Baltimore City Police Commissioner, happens to be white, the head of the Maryland National Guard, also white, the head of the Maryland State Police, also white. Agnew then charged that it was the silence of most of you here today in the face of those radicals that had led to Baltimore's unrest, and now parts of our city lie in ruins. He continued, "You know who lit those fires. They were not lit in honor of your great fallen leader, nor were they lit for an overwhelming sense of frustration and despair. Rather, the fires of Baltimore were, quote, kindled by the advocates of violence." Those in attendance began to leave almost immediately. To be lectured to and blamed at this particular moment and in this particular setting was more than they were willing to accept. Backing up for just a moment, after Agnew's clash with the county council, after his disappointment at losing the judgeship, he rallied in 1962 to become the Baltimore County Executive, which is a really powerful position in the state of Maryland. In 1966, then, he was the clear choice for the Republican nomination for governor. In the 1966 governor's race, the state's Democratic Party, for one last time, nominated a segregationist, George Mahoney. Against Mahoney, then, the support of the black vote almost guaranteed Agnew's election. And now their sense of betrayal was palpable. Tellingly, however, for the backlash years of the mid to late 60s, the Baltimore Sun, the kind of the flagship newspaper for the state, and Agnew's office reported that the positive reaction to his comments overwhelmed the negative. By one count, Agnew's office received over 1,100 letters of support to just 69 opposed. The letters to the editor in the Sun revealed, again, solid local approval of Agnew's remarks. And I'm quoting just a couple of them. "We're proud to be Republicans," wrote one. "I'm thankful to hear that white people will have a strong voice in government," said another. These letters also have very pronounced law and order and tell it like it is themes. One letter signed by 50 Baltimore police officers noted that in their view, and I'm quoting, "It has been a long time since we have heard a politician who has the guts to bring it out in the open and lay it on the line as you did yesterday." While this was happening, a young political staffer named Pat Buchanan began to feed information on Agnew to his boss, a man who at that moment was the odds-on favorite to win the Republican nomination for president, Richard Nixon. Now, let me shift directions here. Zach is going to cover the significance of Agnew's speeches next, and that is part of the context for what I'm going to discuss next, and that is Agnew's appeal to white Southerners to switch to the Republican Party. Agnew's appeal to the white Southerners was evident almost right away, already by the end of the first year, his first year as vice president, as his stump speech regularly laid into the anti-war movement, the Black Power movement, the counterculture, so on. Already by the end of that first year, 1969, the New York Times was reporting that Agnew was, quote, "one of the most popular men in the South." No one would have predicted this a year earlier, right? An urban-born Greek immigrant, son of a Greek immigrant, having that much popularity in the South. The Times also reported that he is the new leader. Agnew is, right? He is the new leader in the drive to expand the Republican strength in the South. By 1971, Agnew was even being hailed as Dixie's favorite. His style and his message resonated with a white Southern constituency that in this era of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act felt abandoned and even threatened by the increasingly liberal Democratic Party. Despite himself being the vice president of the United States, he also shared their resentment of the elites, as when he told a predominantly white audience in Alabama that he understood what it was like to, quote, "wake up each morning to learn that some prominent man or institution has implied that you are a bigot, a racist, or a fool." Harry Dent, a Nixon political advisor from South Carolina, reported to his boss that Southerners were, quote, "ecstatic over the vice president's recent series of speeches." He urged Nixon to keep deploying Agnew to the South, to, quote, "take full advantage of the current situation, and to try to get more switchovers," that's the word they use, switchovers to the Republican Party. Nixon agreed, so Agnew continued to pay special attention to the South, and it worked. Agnew's papers are filled with glowing letters from Southern journalists, politicians, disgruntled Southern Democrats, a testament to the success he had in helping to reshape the GOP during these years. Typical of these letters was one from Congressman James Collins of Texas, and he wrote, "As you can tell when you're in New Orleans, your message really does come through loud and clear in the South. You are doing a tremendous service for the country as the spokesman for the silent majority." By the end of 1969, again, the New York Times is reporting that the vice president is cutting seriously into Mr. Wallace's base of strength in the South, George Wallace. Many observers, the Times says, many observers believe that Mr. Agnew's Southern popularity may have surpassed Mr. Wallace's. With impressive foresight, then, Roy Reed of the New York Times noted that local Southern Democrats feared that, and I'm quoting, "the vice president is the cutting edge of the Republican threat that could eventually cause the once solidly Democratic South to become not just a two-party system region, but predominantly Republican." In 1972, there was some discussion that Agnew might get bumped off the ticket, and his Southern supporters rallied to his defense. For example, Jesse Helms of North Carolina warned that, quote, "if the president is persuaded to replace Agnew, then he will lose a vast amount of the vital conservative support he enjoyed in 1968. One of Helms' constituents then wrote that while he had worked on Nixon's campaign in 68, that he was now waiting to see, quote, if he's going to dump Spiro Agnew in 1972. If Agnew was dumped, he said, come election time, I could go fishing that day. Well, Nixon and Agnew swept the South in their landslide win over McGovern in 72. Looking ahead, white Southerners in particular were among the most enthusiastic in anticipating an Agnew presidential run in 4 years. The political shift that Jerry described had been going on between the parties, and in the South especially, was increasingly evident. As a GOP county chairman from North Carolina wrote to Agnew after the 72 election, he wrote, quote, a new wind is blowing in the political life of the South. If you decide to go for the #1 spot, we are for you. I am of the opinion this applies to the solid South. One cannot help but notice that this letter writer now used solid South to mean a solid Republican South.
So I want you all to see a little, hear a little of Spiro Agnew, so that particularly those of you who don't remember him when from his time in office actually hear what he sounded like and see what he was about. And it's important here, we'll start in 1968 when he was running for vice president. And what's interesting here, you know, Chuck mentioned nobody knew who, or Jerry mentioned nobody knew who he was.
It's Halloween time.
Sorry. There we go. So nobody knew who he was. In fact, when he first was nominated, people thought he was a shellfish. Spiro Agnew was some sort of shellfish. The Democrats ran a very effective political campaign ad against him in 1968. But actually, when they do sort of the history of political campaigning, it's often listed as the top ad. So let's watch it a little. So Agnew would go on, of course, and would win the vice presidency. Sorry here, folks. And would win the vice presidency, and actually Lyndon Johnson would say that he thought Agnew was critical in terms of bringing not only the South but border states along with him, in part because he was deployed sort of to places like not just Birmingham and Atlanta, but also to Des Moines, to Rust Belt states like Wisconsin, where he was an effective campaigner. He becomes vice president. Initially, it looks like he's going to have a very promising role. He's going to play a prominent role. Nixon gives him an office in the West Wing, which is the first time a vice president had an office right next to the president. He's invited down to Key Biscayne, to Florida, where Nixon had his Florida White House, and he's promised to have a prominent role. This quickly becomes a charade. He actually has no role at all. He's a ribbon cutter. He's speaking in front of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, reiterating what the president had said the week before. He has no prominence at all. So this is when he goes to Pat Buchanan, who's a speechwriter for Nixon at the time, and they start to plot, how can we make ourselves relevant? And how he makes himself relevant is part of what you've already heard. He starts attacking elites, and in particular, he starts attacking news media. And so here I'm going to try and jump through a little quickly, but we're going to play a little bit of his talk in Des Moines, Iowa, which happened almost 50 years ago next month, where he attacks the news media. And listen, we're just going to hear a short clip, but listen to the language, because in many ways it should sound very familiar to you.
Each week, American history for 13th, 1979, Vice President Spiro Agnew addressed a Republican Party conference in Des Moines, Iowa. He argued that the big three networks of the time, ABC, NBC, and CBS, were biased against Nixon administration policies, in particular in regards to a recent Vietnam speech by the president. All three networks preempted their evening news programs to broadcast Vice President Agnew's remarks live.
Selecting, presenting, and interpreting the great issues in our nation.
So listen to that, right? What is he saying? He's saying here that a small group of men in New York and Washington are controlling the news. And in fact, more than one commentator afterwards read an anti-Semitic undertone to this. That, of course, it's the Jews in New York and Washington who are controlling the news media. So, but Agnew is identifying this theme that comes through and is now really a common held belief, at least in the Republican Party, that the news media in New York and Washington is biased. And in fact, when you read Pat Buchanan's messages, this is the beginning of Fox News. Of course, who is Nixon's communications director at this time? Roger Ailes, right? So all of this comes back around later. So there are lots of things here, and we're not going to go into this. I really do. It's 5:15, and I want to get to questions from you all. There are lots of things that we find in terms of similarities that you hear today in Donald Trump's Republican Party. Not only the critique of the news media and universities and anti-war protesters, but things like attacking affirmative action, which is an early, he's one of the early people that does this. Support for authoritarian regimes. Agnew takes a trip to his homeland, Greece, which at the time was under the rule of a military junta, and breaks bread with the colonels. Again, no other democratic leader in the world was visiting Greece between 1968 and 1974, but Agnew goes there. Again, our current president seems to have a predilection as well for authoritarian leaders. Now finally, and we'll talk briefly about it, but I actually want to skip through this, is the downfall of Spiro Agnew, which is probably the best known of his history. He pleads no contest to tax evasion in 1973 in a Baltimore courtroom, and we won't watch the clip here. But Agnew was taking kickbacks for contracts that were given to state agencies or to other agencies in the state of Maryland during the time he was both county executive and governor, and those payments continued while he was vice president. So he got brown paper bag full of money in the old executive office building while he was vice president. Now, important here to recognize, Agnew is indicted in October 1973, 10 months before Richard Nixon resigns. He's that close to being president. He's that close, 10 months away from being President of the United States. And we'll talk more about this perhaps when we get into the questions and answers here. Odd postscripts though here about Agnew's life after being Vice President, and also sort of how he's played out in current discussions. So in 1976, he's disbarred, right? He's found guilty of tax evasion. He can't be a lawyer anymore. He ends up trying to sort of figure out what he's going to do with the rest of his life. He's a lobbyist, an international lobbyist for people like Saddam Hussein and Nicolae Ceausescu and the Argentine military. He also writes a steamy novel called The Canfield Decision that is a quasi-bestseller, which I've read, and it's terrible. But this is what he was doing. He also wrote his autobiography as well. And to a certain extent, he was ghosted out of American history. The Republican Party never invited him to conventions. His bust in the US Capitol, which is traditional of all vice presidents, denied until the mid-1990s. He kind of disappears. In fact, you don't see him at all sort of in national news until Nixon's funeral, where he's there for the first time, and when you listen to the commentators, they say, there's Spiro Agnew. Where has he been for the last 20 years? He looks exactly the same. So you didn't hear much about him. There was no significant historical work done on him, nothing, until very recently. So those of you who are followers of MSNBC know that Rachel Maddow did a podcast called Bagman, which was about the end of Spiro Agnew. That was, for at least a couple weeks, the most listened to podcast in America about a year ago. So I do want to talk, and we'll talk about this in the question and answer thing, but Pat Buchanan here is a key connector between the Agnew that we are talking about and the current Republican Party. Ran for president twice, was Reagan's communications director, and in fact, he's been quoted, and we tried numerous times to sit down with him. We never were able to, but he talks about in public things how excited he was when Trump was elected. That this, he thought, was finally the coming of a real Republican who could roll back the New Deal and roll back the Great Society. So he is key. And then we'll maybe save this for question and answers, but you can see the parallels that we've shown you between Trump and Agnew. There are others. There are all sorts of rhetorical connections as well. But this person, we kind of believe without knowing it, because we don't think Trump actually patterned his campaign after Agnew, but without knowing it, he has modeled his whole persona on what Agnew was during his time in office. So with that, it's I know 20 after, let's leave about 20, 25 minutes here for questions. Raise your hand, I'll call on you, and then I'll repeat the question for our video audience.
Was it investigative reporting, or what method uncovered his kickbacks, and was it then handled through the Justice Department?
All right, so the question was how did they find out about him? How did they find out about his wrongdoing? And there's a great story. So there is some investigative reporting here, but the real heroes of this story, and again, this has great parallels to what has happened in this current administration. The real heroes was the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore. So the U.S. Attorney for Baltimore was a man named George Bell, whose brother, J. Glenn Bell, was the Republican senator from the state of Maryland at the time and a big Nixon supporter. And Bell and his team of U.S. attorneys started digging. And they started realizing that there was corruption throughout Baltimore County, and that it led directly to Agnew. And much to his credit, Elliot Richardson, the Republican Attorney General at the time, who had been from Massachusetts, who had been a lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, led the Justice Department, went up to Baltimore, met with the U.S. attorneys, saw the dossier that they compiled on Agnew, and said about his colleague, his Republican colleague, this guy is indictable, and he's done wrongdoing, and he needs to be prosecuted. And so the Republican Attorney General turned on the Republican Vice President and said, there's been a crime committed here, we need to prosecute him. Despite pressure from others against Richardson to not go after him, he does, and he's a great hero in this story in terms of bringing a politician to justice. Now, interesting postscript about Elliot Richardson. 10 days after Agnew is prosecuted and pleads no contest and resigns his vice presidency, Elliot Richardson himself is fired by Richard Nixon in the Saturday Night Massacre. which, of course, at the time was that Richardson wouldn't fire Archibald Cox, who was the special prosecutor in the Watergate prosecution, and instead decides to be fired. So Richardson and the U.S. attorneys are the real great heroes here. There are some journalists, including Richard Cohen, who we talked about before, and the Wall Street Journal also did some excellent reporting. But the real heroes was the Justice Department and the U.S. attorneys. And again, the parallels here to Trump are striking. That in many ways, in addition to the press and sort of uncovering some of the scandals within the Trump administration, the real heroes have been in the Justice Department on this, and in the U.S. Attorney's Office, particularly in the Southern District of New York. I don't know, did you all want to add on this?
I just wanted to add that the reason that Agnew was so indictable is that one of the men who was bribing him kept a meticulous record, a paper trail of the payments, when he made them, and how much they were. So there was an actual paper trail. If you're a U.S. attorney looking for evidence, that's the golden fleece right there.
Yeah, it reminds me also of, Zach mentioned the evening we spent with Richard Cohen and Ben Bradley, and they were rehashing this story, and it was clear they hadn't thought about it for a while. They were just, and do you remember this, and do you remember this? And Cohen gets to the point where he's getting on the case as a journalist, and he's talking to some of the people that are named in the indictment that have talked to the feds, and it's, these guys, these are contractors from Towson, and they're driving down the VW Parkway and being shown into the old executive building with the vice president's office, and the door opens, and there's the vice president of the United States sitting behind his desk, and they come in, and they sit down, and they slide the envelope across the desk, and Agnew puts it in, thank you very much, and off they go. And as Cohen is telling the story, he's like, I still can't believe it, right? The tawdriness of it really stayed with him all these years later. So.
It wasn't that much money either.
Yeah. but he wasn't convicted for taking bribes or kickbacks. It sounds like Al Capone. They get him for bootlegging, they got him for tax evasion.
Well, and so so the question was, he wasn't convicted for bribery, he was convicted for tax evasion. And this was a decision that Richardson at the Attorney General's office made. In part, it was a plea bargain agreement with Agnew that you'll resign and you'll plead no contest and you'll be disbarred, sparing the country what would have been putting the vice president into jail. And so there was, and that would be what would have happened. In fact, we have a quote from Robert Bork, who people will know for other reasons, who was the Solicitor General in the Nixon administration, who said, this guy should go to jail. He should be in jail. And so Richardson, and I think with some wisdom, particularly trying to see what was happening with Watergate, and the realization that you could have the vice president in jail, and conceivably the president in jail, was the thought, we ought not put this guy in jail, we ought not put the country through this, and we ought to move forward on it. So it was a conscious decision to not go after him.
But can't an argument be made that the country would be better off if you made an example of somebody and you've got the goods on him, you know exactly what payments were made when, you had him, he had no leverage, the attorney's office, state's attorney's office had all the leverage, why wouldn't they go for it?
You sort of had to have been there. I guess you were. Maybe you were. I was there. To put, as Zach said, I think it was a responsible decision on the part of Elliot Richardson. You didn't need a long, drawn-out trial under the circumstances with Watergate front and center. It's the same reason that Ford pardoned Nixon. Did he deserve to be pardoned? Well, probably not. But in the end, do you really want to put the country through another nightmare? So I think that was the thing.
But at the time, it was really controversial, and Agnew's letters are enormous. I mean, the collection is at College Park, University of Maryland. It's massive, and we've looked through thousands of the letters of this time, and a lot of them are making that point, and they're angry. They're angry at Richardson, they're angry at Agnew. So it was really controversial at the time. Why does he come off so lightly?
And final comment, doesn't that feed into the politics of resentment? I mean, that's the establishment getting away with it again.
Yeah.
So ironically, it's kind of
It's
feeding
his
into that
defenders,
mentality.
though. Agnew's defenders, and they were loyal. Even as this was going down, Agnew's team was already starting to kind of float the narrative that this was kind of petty. This really wasn't a big deal, right? And technically it was one count of tax evasion from 1967, right? I'm doing the honorable thing here for the good of the country, right? And even at that moment, though, the Baltimore office was wait a minute, right? I mean, Zach said, Bork said this guy should go to jail. So they, in turn, then released basically the copy of the 40-page indictment. Oh yeah? Well, here are 40 pages worth of crimes.
Yeah. One of the other things, and this is sort of salacious, but it's worth mentioning, is that Agnew was going to fight. There was a thought he was going to fight this through, and that in fact, only days before the plea bargain, he is in Los Angeles and gives a speech saying, "I will never resign. I will never, no matter what they say, I will never resign." In a lot of the secondary literature, and to some of the journalists we talked to who were covering the story at the time, the U.S. attorneys didn't say this, but there's ample evidence of it. The feds had gone through all of his receipts, because they were looking for bribery, so they knew how he was spending money. And let's just say there were expensive mink coats bought for people that they couldn't find, jewelry, hotel receipts, cars, to paramours and others that they said, look, we don't want to release this stuff. We don't want to go down this road. And so what many of them said is the reason why this ended so quickly and why they came was that Agnew was faced with this choice. Here is this guy who was the paragon of middle America, who was talking to the silent majority, who played ping pong and watched the Baltimore Colts on Sunday and ate pizza with his perfect family, who really wasn't that at all. And so this is also sort of the understory that we, as you start to read and learn about it, that clearly the feds had things on them and said, well, we don't want to use this. We have no desire to use it. But they came to a conclusion pretty quickly. And then there's so much other stuff going on. This, in addition to Watergate going on, literally 2 days before the indictment, the Yom Kippur War breaks out. And so Nixon is, worried about wider war in the Middle East and Watergate, and this has become sort of thing number 3 or 4 down the list, even though it seems today monumental that a vice president would resign because of such a case. So that also, I think, is part of the context that's really interesting here.
And also the context is that in Maryland politics at this time, this was rampant. Maryland politics is rife with pay-to-play, and this is not to defend Agnew, of course, and what he did, but when Agnew was confronted with this, one of the things he says is everybody does this. Everybody does this. Republicans do it, Democrats do it, I did it, the county executive of Baltimore County who preceded me did it, the governor who was going to succeed me did it, and so there is a culture of corruption. It's a little like Rod Blagojevich in Illinois, who's in jail now for trying to sell Barack Obama's Senate seat. As they took him to jail, he's saying, well, I don't think I did anything wrong. This is just the way it is. And I think that's why Agnew got caught up in this. From our perspective, it's almost bizarre that a sitting vice president is accepting envelopes of cash across his desk, and not even that much money, as I said earlier, but that's the culture that he was in, and that was the Maryland political culture that he came out of.
Take the boy out of Maryland.
I don't know if you regard yourselves as some of the nattering nabobs of negativity, but you brought up a television show, so I'll bring up one, All in the Family. My father loved that show. He genuinely thought that the show was made to showcase Archie Bunker, that Archie Bunker was the hero.
He didn't see the irony.
No, he did not. He thought that the show was made to extol Archie Bunker, and that Meathead actually was a meathead. And he would have regarded all of you as part of the elite.
Yes.
Do you find that there's any difficulty in people like yourselves writing a book like this about somebody who appeals to that audience?
That's a good question, and it's a question that I'm always thinking about as I write history, and that is, what is the role of the historian? And what I tell my classes at that other university up the road is that out there, and I point outside the classroom, you can think whatever you want, believe whatever you want, you can fulminate, you can curse, you can yell, you can scream, but in this room, we are historians, meaning we take a step back, we calm down, we try not to interject our personal feelings and our personal beliefs, and we try to study history with what I call critical sympathy, which is historians have to criticize, they have to judge the past, that's their jobs, but they also have to have some degree of sympathy for the characters, the historical figures they're studying, because they are not in their shoes and they're not in their times, and they have to try to take them on their own terms. So it is not an easy thing to do, to try to take yourself out of it, to try to objectify it. Many historians say that it's not worth even trying. I disagree. I think it is worth trying to take yourself out of it personally. That's the difference between a historian and, as I said, pointing out the window, everybody else out there. So it's not easy, but I think it's what historians should do, and what I think it's fair to say we all try to do.
Yeah, and I think most of us do. I mean, that really is impressed upon me. I wasn't a history undergraduate major, so I didn't really get into studying history officially until I started my graduate training. And just day one, the message is, you've got to be true to what your evidence says, whether you like what you're reading or not. That the whole enterprise, that there's an ethic there of being true to what your evidence says, because the whole enterprise depends on it, and that's something that that I think most of us have taken to heart.
I guess I would add on this. I think we actually take a fairly sympathetic view of Agnew. This is a guy who's been completely forgotten by history, and what we're saying is actually he's very relevant. He's very relevant, and what he did in terms of transforming the Republican Party was significant, and people dismiss him at their peril. The other thing I would mention, because you brought up Archie Bunker, and I think it's important, Archie Bunker was from where? Where's our current president from? Queens. And in fact, Nixon hated All in the Family. There's a whole documentary about how Nixon went crazy that this show was the most popular show in America. And Agnew had no comment on All in the Family, in part because that was him.
Yeah, as human beings writing about this subject, have you taken stock of your own biases that would come to bear on research?
So the question was, as people writing, human beings writing about this subject, have you taken stock of your own biases, your own, and in terms of putting this out there?
Well, I have. I've tried. I don't know whether I've succeeded. We don't know whether we've succeeded. Spiro Agnew made a good number of anti-Semitic statements later in his career, after he had left the vice presidency. That's personally offensive to me, but I tried again. Take a step back, calm down, and try to evaluate him historically as best I can. We're always going to put ourselves into our history and our writing. It's unavoidable. I guess what I'm saying is we shouldn't indulge ourselves. We should fight that feeling and shouldn't indulge ourselves. So I'm sure that I have plenty of biases that I'm not even aware of, but I'm trying to fight against them even if I'm not aware of them.
And I'll just sort of repeat my answer here, that our task is to try and sort out just what went on here, and why was it significant then, and why does it matter to us today? I mean, that's the job, right? And I'll give you a very quick story. When I was writing my dissertation, it was on South Carolina conservatives going back to the 1830s. And the person I was studying was a slaveholder in Charleston. But he was also extremely well educated. And he was writing these essays in the 1840s and 1850s about sort of the future of the American economy, if England is any guide, and it's headed toward industrialization and all the misery that comes with it, et cetera, et cetera. It was really smart stuff, right? And I had this real keen awakening that, personally, I'm opposed to slavery, right? And so, and yet I had to acknowledge that this guy's really smart, and it doesn't matter what I feel about him, right? And I had to convey the intellect that was there in an honest manner. I mean, again, I had to be true to what he was writing. And so, as you do this as historians, it does become easier to do it. You realize it's not really about how you feel of the subjects that you're researching, right? As long as your commitment is to being as true as possible to the evidence that you're finding.
And Spud had your hand up too at one point.
Go ahead. Listening to you, I'm sure it's not in the book, listening to you, it sounds as if this is the key individual figure responsible for taking all of this and making it work for the Republican Party. But as historians, you all know that there are a complexity of factors and figures. So in the book, do you argue that he was a catalyst that was at the right place, but there were other things, other figures, like Wallace and others, like Goldwater, who in some way were also contributing to this as a pool of Americans who were ready to leave the Democratic Party?
Right, absolutely, and this is something that it's always being said of people who are writing their dissertations, that they always think that their subject is the single most important subject. Their individual changed everything. And so for Agnew, there are obviously others, and the two you mentioned, I think, are very important as well. During the 1968 campaign, you obviously have George Wallace, who is almost the extreme version of Spiro Agnew, and actually helps Agnew because Agnew is more reasonable for a lot of Southerners than Wallace. But Wallace is saying a lot of the same things, pointy-headed intellectuals, and I think Wallace talked about professors who don't know how to park a bicycle straight, and a demonstrator who lays down in front of my car, that will be the last car he ever lays down in front of. That made Agnew seem to be moderate by comparison, but Wallace is out there, and also the conduit is Goldwater as well, who is saying a lot of the things in 1964 and pointing at the media, literally pointing at the media during the convention in 1964, the Republican convention that nominated Goldwater, and saying, you people are biased against us, and having his supporters, very emotional supporters, back that up. So Agnew is not the only one in the mix here, but we feel that he is incredibly important, and unlike Wallace and unlike Goldwater, has not gotten his due.
Right, and made it to the vice presidency. Right, suddenly it's at almost the highest level. Just one quick word. I mean, the Wallace influence here is very important, and we do talk about that. And I think for the South itself was changing. It's becoming more urban, more suburban. And Spiro Agnew was a very handsome guy, dapper guy for his time. And for a lot of those sort of New South people, he was more like them, whereas Wallace was a little déclassé, right? But at one point in '68, Agnew's speeches are beginning to sound so much like Wallace's that Wallace says, "I wish I had copywritten my speeches."
I'm enjoying the book. It's fun. I didn't know anything about Agnew. But in the first page, I think it's the first sentence, you say, it is widely believed that Spiro Agnew was the worst president of the 20th century. And then you say, we disagree. But hearing you today, you said that he panders to resentment and anger, and he's a populist. He's not a policymaker. He's a politician. He's relentlessly average. and he was convicted of a crime. So if he's not the worst, who's number one?
All right, so the question is
who was the worst vice president?
Is he in fact the worst? And so what we cite is the American Political Science Association in 2016 had a poll of political scientists, who's the worst vice president of all time, and Agnew won like hands down. Nobody came even close. And I think what we're saying is, in terms of his relevance, in terms of the impact he made, particularly on politics, he's not the worst. Or at least he's not the one who's, he's not someone who should be forgotten. Go back and think of vice presidents even within the last 50 to 60 years who really have virtually no impact on policy or politics. And it's pretty easy to start compiling that list if you can even remember their names. And I think what we're arguing in this book is not that that Agnew is some sort of paragon of excellence or brilliance, but more that he's a relevant political figure of the latter half of the 20th century. In fact, when they polled rhetoricians of the top 100 speeches, American speeches of the 20th century, that Des Moines speech that you saw a little clip of came in 47th. So people recognize this is someone who made an impact. I don't think you'll find Dan Quayle's name on the list. I don't think you'll find, Walter Mondale's name on the list. I mean, so this is someone who we think had an actual impact on the American political trajectory that no other vice president of the last half century really has had. Maybe with the exception of Dick Cheney.
Yeah. If you want to know who the worst vice president in history was, the worst vice president in history was Aaron Burr. Spiro Agnew didn't kill anyone.
Yeah, right. So in terms of significance, right, and I think what Zach called the ghosting of Agnew after his resignation really says a lot about where the political culture was then, right? At the time, he was recognized as, this is a real jolt of energy in the vice presidency we've never really seen before. But then once he resigned, it's a very, very different media age, right? There's no social media. There's not the internet. There was still, you could still be shamed. And if it were to happen today, right? He'd have his own XM radio show, right? He would just pivot right into that. It's just a different time.
He'd be a Fox News contributor.
One of the things we do in the book is we play this sort of counterfactual what-if game. And, Agnew was the front runner to be the nominee in 1976, the Republican nominee. He was the conservative choice. So if he hadn't been indicted and left office, and had perhaps even become president in 1974 when Nixon resigned, he would have been the nominee in 1976. So what does that mean? It means probably Ronald Reagan never would have existed as a national political candidate. And so you have this butterfly effect that, again, would have changed the trajectory of the country. And that also, we think, is something that's unique, that the fact that he disappeared so fast opened the door for Ford, Reagan, and an entirely different conservative movement.
For years ago, we had Charlie Sykes here, and one of the first things he did was ask the audience, maybe 150 people, do you think the media is biased, in the way they portray? Almost all hands went up in the audience, right? And you mentioned, how Agnew and Goldwag and others have sort of pointed fingers at the media, and it just got me thinking about, is there a certain time specifically when that message really resonated with a large number of Americans, or can you sort of point to how it was perceived back at that time, that message?
Well, it's interesting how that idea changes over time, because in the 1930s, the media was also biased against Franklin Roosevelt and against the New Deal. The owners of the newspapers were mostly Republicans. The reporters seemed to like Roosevelt personally, but if you took a poll of the editors of newspapers around the country, and that's the media in the 1930s, Most of them, or the majority of them, were either Republicans or hostile to Roosevelt and the New Deal. So it shifts and it changes. I think that by the 1960s, of course, you have television, you have an explosion for the time of media, of course nothing like what we have now. There was a general perception that the media was starting to become biased against Republicans, and it wasn't just Barry Goldwater and Spiro Agnew who were making those charges. Dwight Eisenhower, who was still very respected in the United States in the 1960s after his term of office had concluded, he too criticized the media in 1964 and claimed that they were anti-Republican. So I think that idea started to have traction in the mid-1960s.
That's right. And one thing about what's significant about the Des Moines speech, as we referred to it, was what's important to understand about the Des Moines speech is that this isn't just Agnew complaining about the media and about perhaps media bias. This was orchestrated, right? That Pat Buchanan had gone to Nixon and said, "Let's make this an issue," right? It's not just reactive; it's proactive. Let's make this an issue. And Buchanan's message to Nixon is, this is going to devastate. This is going to discredit their viewers, millions of viewers. And Nixon loved it, right? Let's do it. And it was so. The complaints have been there, but really what that Des Moines speech does in Agnew is to use a term we would use today, they weaponize that point.
I think it's Nixon who said after that flicked the scab off, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Why do you think that Americans buy into these cultural issues like race and LGBTQT and immigrants at the expense of their economic interests? Is it because they mistake the source of their oppression?
Well, it would take a while to answer that one. That's the $64,000 question, and a question that many Democrats have been asking for many years. And I'm sure that if you asked Hubert Humphrey on the day after the election, he would have asked of the 68 election that he had lost to Nixon and Agnew, he would ask that question as well. My view, as I mentioned in my remarks, is that cultural issues are often a luxury for Americans in times of economic prosperity. And if you take the period from the beginning of World War II up until around 1970-71, you have constant growth in the American economy. And one of the things that American policymakers are always arguing about, whether they talk about it or not openly, is the idea of redistribution. Should economic resources be redistributed, and if so, how? Between the World War II years and the early 1970s, America managed to avoid and elide those questions because of growth. Growth was going to allow Americans to avoid those kind of deep economic questions. And I think when those questions are shunted off to the side, cultural and racial issues come to the fore. And I don't want to minimize cultural issues and racial issues by calling them luxuries. They're not luxuries, but if the economy is doing well, the conversation changes. Why someone who is on the wrong side of an economic shift is still going to focus on cultural issues and vote for Republicans, as they did in the 1960s, and not Democrats. Well, if we could solve that riddle, we would all have tremendous knowledge. That's very, very hard to understand.
In the process of writing the book, what have you learned from the silent majority, or what are the best methods of communicating to that population?
What I would say is take them seriously. Take them and their complaint seriously. It's very, very difficult to claim that someone, a white American who is working class is privileged, and that's a word that's used a lot. They are obviously privileged, but some whites are privileged more than others. Some whites are privileged much more than others, and that has to be taken into account. So what I would say is take them seriously. You don't always have to agree with them, but take them seriously and don't write them off. that's sometimes difficult, okay? Because there's a lot of racism sometimes mixed in. We can't always tease it out. But I would just say, take it seriously on their own terms.
We'd like to thank these fine authors and give them a good round of applause. The book will be out a week from today, and there is a tear sheet circulating with information on the book if you want to pursue it or ask the local library to get it. You also have in front of you a little card with a Q&R code. If you scan that Q&R code into your camera on your iPhone, it will connect you to the websites for the Center for Politics and the People, and you can follow our events as they develop. Charlie Sykes was mentioned by my co-director. Charlie Sykes will be coming back to Ripon College in mid-November to talk about the current political situation and the media. We will give you the exact date when it occurs, but it will be around the middle of November. At the end of October, our next event, October 29th, right after fall break, we will do a viewing of a new documentary called You're Not Alone. And it was made by PBS Television and Kids in Crisis in Wisconsin, an organization that looks at mental health among young Americans. And we'll have journalist Rory Lenane from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel here, who has worked on the documentary, and some of the teenagers who appear in the documentary. That will be October 29th, 5:30 to 7 in the Heritage Room with some delicious food from Sodexo. And with that, we'd like to invite you to a reception of Sodexo food right now in Wensink Lounge for further discussion with our authors. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for our authors being here.